The river didn't welcome her, not kindly. Its current wasn't swift, but the cold clung like judgment, curling up the bones in her feet as she stepped barefoot into the shallows. Alice didn't cry. Not when the hem of her dress darkened, not when her teeth chattered. Not when the icy water rose up past her knees and her fingers, trembling, hovered near the buttons of her blouse. She just looked forward, not blinking, like the water might take her into forgetting. But she wasn't trying to die, not fully. She wanted the sting, the cold, the silence. She wanted to be washed of it all. The prairie wind whispered behind her, carrying with it the cruel laughter of town girls and the rusted memory of her father's voice saying, "She'll never be chosen, not with that behind her." She thought she was alone. Until the crunch of a boot on dry river rock stopped her breath. The man didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He stepped into the water like it meant nothing to him. Moccasins soaked, hair tied back, face unreadable. Apache, tall and lean, maybe 30. Eyes like dusk, not dark, but quiet. Watching. "Don't," she said hoarsely. "I ain't doing nothing wrong." Still, he came. One arm lifted gently, not to grab, but to offer. She backed deeper. Her heel slipped on a smooth stone. She stumbled, and the cold swallowed her to the waist. Then hands, strong and sure, caught her before she could sink. He carried her out like a child. Her limbs shook, more from shame than cold. Her wet dress clung to her body like second skin, transparent in the morning light. She hated herself for how weak she looked. But he didn't look at her that way. He didn't ask who she was or why she'd been in the river. He didn't ask what had been taken, or what she'd tried to give away to keep a place in the world. He just wrapped her in a thick woven blanket, lifted her onto the back of his horse, and walked beside her through the cottonwoods without saying a word. The forest grew quieter the deeper they rode. Branches arched overhead, and sunlight blinked through like scattered memory. Her throat ached, and the river left behind a trail of shivers that even the blanket couldn't chase away. She meant to ask where he was taking her, but when she looked down and saw the way he led the horse, gentle, unhurried, always glancing up to check on her, she swallowed the question. Wherever it was, it couldn't be worse than the town. His cabin came into view like something half-remembered. Modest, sturdy, built against a rise of stone and pine. A small corral stood off to one side, a thick-coated horse nibbling at dry grass. Smoke rose from a stovepipe. She wondered, absurdly, if he had a wife inside. A child. Someone to be outraged. But the house was still. The door creaked open to his hand, and when he carried her inside, no voice called out. He laid her gently on a bearskin rug near the hearth and stoked the fire higher, feeding it pine logs until the room flickered with orange light. She sat upright, arms clinging to her knees. The blanket smelled like cedar and something fainter, sage, maybe. Her teeth chattered. She still hadn't said her name. Neither had he. He poured water into a kettle and placed it over the flames. Then he disappeared into the back room and returned with a plain dress. Calico, faded but clean. He set it beside her without speaking. "You don't gotta do this," she said finally, voice splintering. He knelt to feed the fire again, then sat back on his heels. "You were cold." That was all. She changed in silence once he left the room, hands fumbling with buttons stiff from cold. The dress fit loosely, but it was dry. It felt like dignity. When he returned, he handed her a tin cup of tea that smelled of river mint and something earthy. "I don't know your name," she whispered. "Tahlequah," he said. "You don't have to tell me yours." "Not yet." She nodded, a lump rising. His voice had a worn gentleness to it, like a story read too many times. He took the chair across from her, near the fire but not too close. Between them, the heat shimmered like an unspoken question. "You live here alone?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze moved toward the back wall where a simple cedar necklace hung. A woman's, no doubt. Nothing else needed saying. She studied his face, not for beauty, though he was handsome in a way no one in town would understand. He looked carved by time and weather, with a softness around the eyes that felt earned, not given. A man who had seen too much and asked for nothing. I wasn't trying to die, she said. It came out suddenly, like a confession she didn't mean to speak. I know. Just, her hands twisted the hem of the dress. They said I was ruined. That no one'd want me. That after what I lost, I didn't belong. He said nothing, but the way he looked at her then, like she wasn't broken but simply tired, made her throat ache more than the river had. Outside, dusk pressed softly against the windows, and the wind carried the scent of juniper. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. Her body trembled still, but it wasn't cold anymore. He stood and moved to the shelf, took down a small loaf of bread and a jar of something dark, preserved berries. He handed them to her like a peace offering. She took them with both hands. She ate slowly, watching the firelight reflect in the shine of his black braid. He sat again, this time in the chair beside hers, close enough that their knees nearly touched. I was pregnant, she whispered. I lost it. They all said it was my fault. Even my father said he didn't want me coming back. Still, he said nothing. Not to question. Not to judge. He simply stared into the fire and listened. I don't have anywhere. You do now, he said. Those words made her eyes sting worse than anything the town ever had. She didn't cry, not yet. But she leaned her head against the arm of the chair, and when her breathing slowed and the food sat heavy in her belly, her eyelids dropped like stones into still water. Later, she woke in the middle of the night, not from dreams but from silence. Tahlequah sat on the porch, a small wooden flute in his hands. He played softly, slow, aching notes that didn't rise, just wandered. She watched through the window, her body still weak, her soul even more so. But something shifted. Something about that music, made for no one, not performed, settled into her bones. Like the river's cold was gone. Like she was still here for a reason. She curled back under the blanket and let herself sleep, not safe exactly, but no longer hunted by shame. And outside, the wind carried a note of something unexpected, almost like hope. The mornings came with frost on the windows and the slow cracking of firewood. Alice woke to the sound of kindling snapping in the hearth, the scent of pine smoke curling beneath the quilt. Her dress was folded beside her, warm from the stove, and her boots had been wiped clean of mud. Nothing was ever said about it. Nothing needed to be. She moved through the house quietly, like a guest in a memory. Tahlequah didn't fill silences. He let them hang like mist, thick and present. He nodded at her in the mornings and offered tea without asking. She took it with a whisper of thanks. Some days that was the only word they exchanged until dusk. There were 2 chairs by the fire, one cedar, one worn oak. He always took the cedar. She sat in the other. Between them was a table with a single carved feather in the center. She traced it with her finger as the tea cooled in her hands. He taught her without words. One afternoon, he left a small bowl of oats beside a bundle of thread. She followed him outside, watched how he mixed it with pine tar to patch a saddlebag. The next morning, she patched another without asking. His eyes softened when he saw it. Their days fell into rhythm. She learned how to feed the hens and where the creek curved sharp near the willows. He showed her how to dry mint leaves and when to whistle for the mares. In return, she kept the hearth warm and the bread rising, and never asked about the cedar necklace on the wall. She noticed it often though. Braided leather, smooth river stone, something feminine and sacred about the way it hung. The first time she'd seen it, she'd known better than to touch it. It wasn't just decoration. It was memory, suspended. She wanted to ask him what her name had been. The woman before. But some wounds weren't opened with blades, they opened with questions. And she hadn't earned that kind of trust yet. He never looked at her with hunger. Never with pity either. Just consideration. As if she was a book left open in the sun. Something delicate, something not his to close. The shame in her, still coiled from the river and all that came before, began to loosen its grip. Not because he healed her, but because he didn't ask her to hurry. One day she found a sewing tin in the corner of the back room. She used it to take in the shoulders of the calico dress. Her hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but her stitches were clean. When she stepped out into the firelight that night, he looked at her, not startled, not even long, but he looked. "You made it fit," he said. She nodded. It was the first compliment she'd received in months that hadn't been laced with conditions. Later, she sat across from him, the hem of her dress grazing her ankles. He passed her a cup of something sweet, and they listened to the wind scrape against the eaves. That was the night she noticed the picture. A crude sketch, charcoal on yellowed paper, framed in driftwood above the mantel. A woman with sharp cheekbones and a thick braid. Not beautiful in the way townsfolk described, but dignified. Strong. The resemblance to Alice's own face was faint but enough to sting. "You drew her?" she asked softly. He nodded, eyes not moving from the fire. "I don't forget easily. She looks like someone who would have survived the river. She never would have gone near it." The words weren't cruel. They just sat heavy. Alice turned her face toward the flame, trying not to let the guilt rise. She didn't know what she wanted from him: approval, affection, a place, but she knew she didn't want to be compared. The next morning, she left before sunrise, feet crunching frost as she walked to the edge of the woods. She didn't plan to run. She just needed space to feel the ache. But he found her there. Not angry. Just present. He handed her a small bundle, thick gloves, made of soft hide, stitched with care. "You'll need them. For mending fence posts. Frost burns." She took them, unsure whether to cry or thank him. Instead, she slipped them on and let her fingers warm slowly. They worked side by side that day, hammering down broken stakes along the western ridge. She watched how he moved, quiet, efficient. Not a man rushing to finish, but one who honored every task as if it mattered. Midday, while tightening wire, she caught her palm on a rusted nail. The cut was shallow but red. She flinched. He took her hand in both of his, warm and careful. He tore a strip from his undershirt, wrapped it around her gently, knotting it without looking up. "Hold it like this," he said, guiding her fingers. His skin brushed hers, calloused and warm. She held the pressure as he showed her, her throat tight with something she didn't have the right to name yet. That evening, when she laid the gloves beside the fire to dry, she found a small silver button stitched inside one cuff. She hadn't noticed it before. The town had always called her forgettable. But someone who took time to stitch a button where no one could see? That was a man who noticed everything. They ate dinner in near silence, stew, thick with beans and dried meat. She set 2 plates. He cleaned them after. Then they sat in their chairs again, the cedar and the oak. Neither one spoke. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of what they hadn't said yet. And what they were learning to say without speaking. She fell asleep that night not to dreams, but to the memory of his hands, how they didn't flinch from the wound. How they didn't tremble when she did. And in the quiet that followed, she whispered one word aloud to the rafters, the fire, and the world that had once spat her out. Home. The wagon creaked as it rolled into town, its wheels layered in frost that hadn't melted since morning. Alice sat beside Tahlequah, wrapped in a blue shawl he'd given her the night before, coarsely woven, warm, and heavy with meaning. It still smelled faintly of horses and pine smoke. She held it close like a shield. Tahlequah held the reins with one hand, calm as the quiet before snow. He didn't speak, not even as the town buildings rose around them, weathered facades with peeling paint, crooked signs swaying in the wind, and windows that stared back like judging eyes. Alice knew the town. Or rather, it knew her. Even before the river, it had found reasons to avoid her. She'd carried letters for other girls. Waited outside shops. Wasn't allowed to linger near the dressmaker's window. Too plain. Too strange. Too much story wrapped around her name. Now she was back, and nothing had changed except that she wasn't alone. A boy nudged his friend near the mercantile, whispering. A woman at the laundress line paused mid-slap of her wet sheet and narrowed her eyes. Miss Liddy, with her stiff apron and sharper tongue, watched from her porch swing like a queen assessing trespassers. They dismounted quietly. Tahlequah nodded toward the general store. Need flour. Rope too, he said. She followed, steps small, hands tucked into the shawl as if it could fold her away. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Mr. Mallory, the storekeeper, looked up and blinked slowly. He nodded at Tahlequah. Got what you asked for last month. Dried peaches too. His eye slid to Alice. Then paused. Something tightened in his jaw. She's with me, Tahlequah said, voice even. Mr. Mallory hesitated only a second longer than necessary before turning to gather their things. He handed the bag to Tahlequah, not to her. Not even a glance. Outside, children stopped playing to watch them. A few giggled. One little girl asked her mother, "Is that the river lady?" The mother pulled her child aside with a hiss. Don't point. Alice's throat burned, but she didn't look down. She looked up, chin just high enough to pretend she didn't hear. Tahlequah handed her the parcel and walked ahead slowly, letting her choose whether to follow. She did. At the smith's stall, they waited while a rusted hinge was reforged. The blacksmith, Ezra, gave a curt nod, but nothing more. Alice kept her eyes on the coals. Behind them, voices floated through the wind, Miss Liddy's among them, too clear to ignore. She was found in the river, you know. Carried off like trash, and now look at her, parading around in that poor man's shawl. She's dangerous. Brings death to men's homes. Filling a dead woman's shoes before the pine even weathers. Alice closed her eyes. But Tahlequah didn't flinch. He turned around, slowly, calmly, and locked eyes with Miss Liddy from across the way. Then, with perfect stillness, he spoke just loud enough for all to hear. She is not trash. She is not shame. She is alive. That's more than can be said for your kindness. The town stilled. For one suspended breath, even the wind seemed to hold back. He didn't wait for response. He simply walked on, Alice beside him, the bag of flour tucked under her arm like a prize she hadn't earned but was holding nonetheless. At the chapel, Pastor Elijah stood on the stoop, coat blowing open, eyes sharp but kind. He stepped down to meet them. Tahlequah, he said warmly. Didn't expect you back so soon. We needed supplies, Tahlequah said. His voice didn't carry anger, only calm warning, like a thundercloud that had not yet struck. Pastor Elijah turned to Alice and tipped his hat. Miss, welcome back. You're always welcome in the house of the Lord. Alice almost thanked him, but words caught in her throat. She nodded instead. As they turned to go, Elijah put a hand on Tahlequah's arm. You know they'll talk. They already are. Some folks take longer to change. That's all I'll say. Tahlequah met his gaze. She's not theirs to change. They left without another word. That night, as firelight painted the cabin walls in gold and ash, Alice sat in the oak chair. She didn't speak. Not at first. She folded and unfolded the corner of the flour sack, then finally looked up at him. They hate me. They don't know you. They don't want to. He stirred the coals. The land doesn't ask what you did before. It just takes your steps. Grows where you walk. I wanted to disappear, she said. Now I think they want me to stay invisible. Tahlequah looked at her for a long time. Not with pity. Not with comfort. But with something steady, unshaken. You're not invisible here. She swallowed. You didn't have to defend me. I didn't defend you, he said. I told the truth. Silence settled between them again, but it was different now. Thicker. Rooted. She rose to pour water into the basin, watching steam curl like smoke. I think I'd like to grow something, she said softly. In the spring. If it's all right. His eyes didn't leave her. Then we'll clear the patch behind the corral, he said. There's sun there. And that was that. No declarations. No apologies. Just quiet agreements. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, as if trying to warn them or bless them. It was hard to tell which. Inside, she laid her shawl over the back of the chair, her shoulders bare to the firelight. She didn't tremble anymore. And when she finally lay down that night, she didn't dream of the river. She dreamed of warm soil. Of seeds. Of small hands helping her plant something that would rise. The fever came in the middle of the second snowfall. It started with a shiver Alice couldn't shake. She sat too close to the fire that night, her cheeks flushed, eyes unfocused. She stirred the stew too long, forgot to salt the bread. When she dropped a wooden bowl and didn't bend to pick it up, Tahlequah watched her closely. By morning, her skin burned with heat that didn't come from the hearth. She tried to stand, but her legs folded beneath her like dry reeds. He carried her to the bed gently, as if her body might splinter. Her breath was shallow, her lips cracked. When he placed a wet cloth across her brow, her eyes fluttered but didn't open. Outside, the wind howled across the trees, and snow piled against the windowsills. He stayed beside her, night after night, feeding the fire and pressing water to her lips. He spoke in whispers, soft words in Apache, half prayer, half lullaby. "She's strong," he murmured to the flames. "She's just tired. She'll wake." He set dried sage in the boiling pot and crushed willow bark into her tea. His hands never shook, but his eyes reddened by the third day. She tossed in her sleep, muttering things he didn't understand, names, apologies, fragments of songs. Once, she said, "I'm sorry, Papa," and wept. Another time she whispered, "Please. I'll try to be better." He didn't answer those words. Just pressed a hand to her shoulder and said, "You're safe. That's enough." On the fourth day, he rode to the high ridge for snowmint and caught the scent of smoke on the air, thin and sharp, not from pinewood. He followed it downhill until the trees opened into a clearing where a wagon lay half-burned and silent. Its side was scorched black. The horse was gone. Blood stained the snow like rust. He nearly turned away, there were too many bodies in the west already. But then he heard a sound. Faint. Not wind. A cry. He found the girls beneath the wagon, curled together like animals in fear. One clutched a doll made of corn husk, the other sucked on a frostbitten thumb. They were no older than 5. They didn't scream when he lifted them. Just held tighter to each other. He wrapped them in his coat and rode fast through the snow, the younger one pressed against his chest, the elder bundled behind him, arms looped tight around his ribs. When he arrived, Alice was still burning. He set the girls near the fire, hands outstretched, silent and wide-eyed. One coughed. The other began to sob aloud and sudden, like it had been held in too long. He fed them first stew and sweetbread and tea. They didn't speak. Didn't ask for their parents. Perhaps they already knew. He sat them beside Alice's bed once they were warm. They looked at her face, flushed and still, and the elder one asked, almost whispering, "Is she our new mama?" He didn't answer. But he tucked them under the quilt beside her and said, "She will be, if she wakes." That night, he sat by the fire carving tiny figurines out of pine. A fox for one girl, a bird for the other. His hands moved automatically, but his mind stayed at the bedside. At dawn, the fever broke. Alice coughed once, then again. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking at the ceiling. Her lips moved. He leaned close. "Where are we?" she rasped. "Home," he said. She frowned, dazed. "It's warm. You've been sleeping." She tried to sit. He stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. "You need rest. Drink this." She sipped the tea he offered, her hands trembling. Then she noticed the 2 girls tucked under the quilt, asleep on either side of her. Who? They were left. Near a burned wagon. Alice blinked. "They're orphans?" He nodded. "So were you. For a while." She looked down at them. One stirred in her sleep and reached for Alice's hand. Fingers closed around hers like ivy curling toward sun. She didn't pull away. "They're scared," she said softly. They were cold, he replied. You were, too. Alice brushed hair from the girl's forehead. Do they have names? They didn't say. She nodded, lips pressing into a line. Then we'll give them new ones. He didn't smile. Not quite. But his eyes shone in the firelight. By noon, Alice had sat up, still weak but stronger than before. She braided the girl's hair, slowly, hands remembering what they hadn't done in years. I used to dream of a daughter, she said. But after the baby, they said my womb would never hold again. Tahlequah didn't flinch. He poured more tea and said, not all family comes through blood. The girl sat beside her on the floor, drawing in the ashes of the hearth with sticks. One drew a house with a chimney. The other drew 4 stick figures holding hands. They want to stay, she said. Then they will. Later that evening, the snow stopped. The world outside glowed with clean white silence. Inside, the air warmed with soup, cedar, and children's laughter. Alice moved slowly, but she stood unaided to sweep the floor. She watched the girls chase each other, giggling, and for a moment, she forgot about the town, the river, the names she'd been called. She forgot she was unwanted. I think, she said, they can call me Mama if they want. Tahlequah stood behind her, quiet. Then he said, you should choose your name, too. She looked back. What do you mean? He met her eyes, steady. You've lived long enough carrying other people's shame. Choose who you are now. She didn't answer right away. Just turned toward the window, watching snowflakes drift through fading light. I'll think about it, she said. But I like how it sounds. Mama. That night, the girls curled up beside her again, warm and full. Tahlequah sat on the porch, flute in hand, playing something soft and searching. Inside, Alice traced the curls on the girls' foreheads with her fingers, whispering words she hadn't used in years, gentle ones, lullabies without lyrics. She looked at the fire, at the cedar walls, at the shawl folded by the chair. The fever was gone. The river was far behind. And her heart, for the first time in a long while, was not empty. It was full of small hands and soft music. And a quiet man who never asked to be loved only made space for her to return when she was ready. The fair arrived with the first green buds of spring, sudden, fragile, and full of risk. By then, the girls had names. The elder answered to Junie, the younger to Fern. Alice had stitched them dresses from leftover flour sacks, each one with crooked hems and mismatched buttons they wore like medals. They followed her everywhere, barefoot and sure-footed, as if they'd always belonged to her. Tahlequah watched from the porch, hands resting on the whittled rail, a half-carved flute in his lap. He didn't speak much in those weeks, but when Alice passed near him, his eyes would follow, not in hunger, not in need, but in deep recognition. Like a man remembering a song he thought he'd lost. She planted spinach and sage behind the cabin, her hands in the dirt before the snow was fully gone. When her knees ached, she smiled through it. When the girls asked why the plants grew slowly, she only said, things that last don't rush. It was Pastor Elijah who stopped by with word of the spring fair, candles, bread, music, and dancing beneath lanterns strung between cottonwoods. Alice didn't say yes, not at first. But when Fern tugged at her sleeve and said, will there be apples, she looked at Tahlequah, waiting for some signal. He gave only the smallest nod. They went as a family. The wagon wheels hummed over thawed earth, wildflowers pushing up through grass like the land itself was waking. When they arrived, silence fell. Townsfolk stared. Some with recognition. Some with confusion. Many with judgment that clung like burrs. Alice stepped down in her simple white dress, no lace, no veil, just hand-stitched cotton with a faded blue sash. Her hair was braided and tied with twine. The girls wore matching ribbons. Miss Liddy stood near the church steps, mouth tight as dried fruit. Back again, she muttered. A group of women turned their backs. But the girls didn't notice. They ran toward the table of honey sticks and soap bars, laughing. Alice let them go. Then she turned to Tahlequah, who stood beside her, calm as ever. I don't want to hide anymore, she said. You don't have to. I want them to see. I want them to know what you are to me." He didn't answer. Just held her gaze, steady and waiting. She took his hand. Together, they walked through the fairgrounds, past the whisperers, past the smirks, past the men who looked and looked away. The shawl she once used as a shield now draped over her shoulders like a banner. She stopped in front of Pastor Elijah, who stood beneath a lantern, sipping cider, pretending not to notice the storm building around them. Alice spoke first. "We've come to marry." The cider sloshed in his cup. "I see," he said carefully. She looked at Tahlequah, then back. "He's never asked. But I want it said. I want my name to mean something again. I want the girls to know they came from a family that chose each other." Elijah glanced over her shoulder at the growing crowd, then set his cup aside. "Do you have a ring?" "No," she said. "Just his name." Tahlequah finally spoke. "I didn't ask her for anything. But she's given me everything." A hush rolled through the square like wind before thunder. Miss Liddy's arms folded tight. Mr. Mallory stepped forward, brow furrowed. Elijah raised his hand. "Then let it be known. Before God in this town, two souls stand together. Not by law, not by favor, but by will." He looked to Alice. "Do you take this man, without title, without coin, without permission, to be your home?" She didn't blink. "I take him with nothing but his quiet." Then to Tahlequah. "Do you take this woman, once cast aside, now standing in her own name?" "I do." Elijah nodded. "Then you are wed. And may the West be kinder to you than the world has been." A long silence followed. Then, from the far edge of the crowd, someone clapped. Just once. A woman with silver hair and tears in her eyes. Then another joined. And another. Until even the whispers were drowned in the sound of hands coming together, slow and stunned. Junie and Fern ran forward and hugged their legs. "Mama," they said. "He's our papa now, right?" Alice nodded, kneeling, gathering them in her arms. "Yes, darlings. He's ours." Tahlequah reached down and pulled her gently to her feet. There were no kisses. No dances. Just the way his hand held hers, firm, but reverent. That night, they sat on the porch while the girls slept inside, curled like kittens at the foot of the bed. The moon was full. The world was quiet. Alice leaned against his shoulder. "I used to think I had to earn love," she whispered. "Now I know I just had to stop hiding from it." Tahlequah said nothing. But his fingers laced with hers. The wind moved through the trees like an old song. She looked up at him and said, "I don't want to be called Alice May anymore." He turned to her. "What do you want?" She smiled. "Just call me yours." And he did. Not with a word, but with his arms wrapped around her, and the silence that followed deep, complete, and full of everything unspoken. And the West, for once, held its tongue. Because it knew this was not a tale of rescue, nor pity, nor even defiance. It was a story of choosing, day after day, without permission. And sometimes, that was the most radical kind of love.